I remember this story with chilling clarity. It is a memory that sticks firmly in my mind whenever I think about playing hide and seek in the dark, or whenever my path crosses a desolate alleyway. I will never, ever forget the events that unfolded. It was in the early days of October, the air sharp and crisp with the true feel of fall. On this particular occasion, my 3 siblings and I had traveled to visit our mother at her apartment. I have an older sister, whom I'll call Jess, and my 2 younger brothers, whom I'll refer to as Mike and Eli. Our parents had divorced 2 years prior to this visit, which meant our opportunities to see our mother were scarce. This visit was facilitated by our father, a conscious effort on his part to be a good parent and allow us to see her, even though he was not legally required to do so. Mom's apartment was unfortunately located in a particularly sketchy part of town. The area around the apartment complex was dense with a lot of old buildings, yet it always felt strangely empty despite the general crowdedness. The atmosphere was unsettling. My mother's apartment building was located directly adjacent to a long, dark alleyway, which oddly enough also served as the main entrance and access point to the complex itself. This is what I mean when I describe the area as sketchy. If you were to try and search for the building, you probably wouldn't find it unless you knew specifically to drive or walk down that long, dark alleyway. My mother's apartment was situated on the 2nd story, providing a small sense of elevation and distance from the street. Despite the difficult location, my siblings and I were always genuinely excited whenever we got the opportunity to visit her. I loved my mom very much. Her apartment, too, was a comfort. It was small and cozy. The apartment itself was very comfortable, a welcome sanctuary from the neighborhood. It had a familiar, lived-in feel, reminding me warmly of my grandmother's place, filled with soft furniture and all sorts of unnecessary decor simply lying around. It was a cozy and familiar environment. Another great thing about visiting her apartment was the immediate presence of friendly neighbors. A while back, during one of our previous visits, we had made good friends with the neighbors downstairs, a boy whom I'll call Zach, and his sister, Chi-Chi. Zach and I spent a significant amount of our time playing games in the complex's parking lot area, which was located right next to the long, shadowed alleyway. We played typical, classic childhood games like cops and robbers, tag, and kickball. However, on this particular visit, with October well underway and Halloween approaching, we decided on a much more thrilling game. Zach was the one who came up with the idea that completely shifted the atmosphere of the evening. Since it was October and near Halloween, we should play hide and seek. But he took the thrill one step further by proposing we play it outside at night. My siblings immediately loved the idea and wanted to join in the fun. We all quickly agreed that at precisely 9 p.m., we would quietly leave our rooms, converge outside, and begin the game. Since it was already mid-October, The night descended very fast, and the darkness arrived quickly. This resulted in the perfect, naturally spooky lighting that was ideal for the thrilling game we had planned. The group was set. It was me, my sister Jess, my brothers Mike and Eli, and our friends Zach and Chi-Chi. 6 of us, ready to play. As soon as the clock finally hit 9 p.m., we all executed our plan exactly as we had discussed. We slipped out of our respective rooms and apartments and quietly met up with each other outside. The area around the building's corners was quite dark, deeply shadowed and mysterious. However, the main parking lot was partially illuminated by the tall lampposts, which cast a noticeable orange, rusty color onto the concrete. To decide who would be the first seeker, or it, we played that classic little childhood game, bubblegum in a dish. We continued the rhyme until the role of the seeker finally fell to Zach. He immediately turned to face the wall and began counting. Everyone else scattered quickly, running off to find their chosen hiding spots. Our boundaries were loose, not too far from the complex's edge, but also not limited strictly to the parking lot area itself. I remember instinctively running with my older sister, Jess. I always felt safest sticking close to her, as she was the oldest and the most reassuring presence. We ran toward a spot near the back of the apartment building, specifically targeting the area where the large industrial garbage tins were located. The only way to reach this concealed spot was to enter the long, dark alleyway and proceed further down until the very end of the building was fully exposed. That's precisely what we did. We figured that the seeker, Zach, would never go all the way over to this remote, smelly area, so it seemed like the absolute perfect hiding spot. We quickly squeezed ourselves behind the large bins and waited. As we settled, we heard Zach's voice, now muffled by the distance and the walls, shout the final call, ready or not, signifying that the game had officially started. At first, the act of hiding was exciting and filled with adrenaline, but the excitement quickly faded away once we had to simply wait for Zach to come by and find us. The environment descended into a profound silence, broken only by the natural, subtle noises of the night. The stillness started to feel unsettling. I began to get impatient, and my sister, Jess, was feeling it too. She whispered quietly to me that they would eventually come all the way down here and find us. However, after what felt like an endless couple of minutes, we both started to get decidedly bored. I was definitely bored. I finally whispered my thought, maybe we hid too well. Jess let out a small, soft laugh at my comment. She then proposed that maybe we should just get out of our hiding spot and forfeit the game altogether, especially since it was starting to feel quite late in the night. The prospect of ending the wait and rejoining the others was instantly appealing. We agreed to forfeit. We cautiously started to move out from behind the pile of garbage bags and carefully stepped aside from the large metal bins. This movement brought us out into the dead middle of the alleyway. It was at this precise moment that my heart dropped. I looked instinctively toward the far end of the long alley, where the light was weakest, and was met with the sight of a figure standing motionless in the faint pool of light. I instantly knew with a sinking feeling that this was not anyone I knew. The person was unnaturally tall, exceptionally so, giving the distinct impression that they had added extra height, perhaps with hidden lifts in their shoes. The low, direct, overhead light made it impossible to see their face clearly, as their hair cast a massive, dark shadow, completely obscuring their features. Despite the dark shadow, a horrifying detail finally registered in the dim light. The figure's hair. It was a brightly colored afro, disturbingly similar to a clown wig. The worst possible thought immediately flashed into my mind. It was a clown. I forced myself to examine the figure's silhouette more closely, and the shape of the clothing definitely reinforced my terrifying suspicion. It absolutely appeared to be a clown costume. It wasn't even close to Halloween yet, which only heightened the confusion and the sheer dread. Why was someone dressed as a clown, standing completely still, alone in this deserted, sketchy alleyway? What made the sight truly bone-chilling was the person's absolute lack of movement. They simply stood there, frozen solid, and were clearly staring right at us with an unnerving focus. My sister, Jess, immediately sensed the profound danger and strange nature of the situation. She instinctively pulled me back, away from the sight of the static clown. Whispering urgently, she told me that we absolutely had to turn around and quickly go back with the others. We didn't need to discuss it further. The fear was palpable. We immediately made our way back down the long, dark alleyway, our earlier impatience completely forgotten, replaced by a desperate, intense need to find our friends and brothers, to feel safe in numbers. Fortunately, we didn't have to go far before we found two members of our group relatively close to the alley's main entrance, my brother Mike and our friend Chi-Chi. Mike was genuinely confused as to why we were walking out in the open like that, clearly thinking that the game of hide-and-seek was still ongoing. We quickly told Mike and Chi-Chi that we had seen something truly weird, and we urgently explained the sight of the weird guy dressed as a clown standing motionless at the far end of the alleyway. The area where we now stood was still technically within the clown's line of sight, a terrifying realization that spurred us to move. We quickly moved aside and pointed down the passage to show them exactly what we had just seen. It was at this moment that the situation escalated from merely strange to openly threatening, and we started to realize the situation was far more serious than we initially thought. The clown was no longer in the distance. It was closer. It had moved, clearly, without us noticing the motion. It was still silently watching us with an intense focus, and then, slowly and deliberately, it raised a hand and started to wave at us. ... With the clown's proximity, we could now see more details of its appearance. Its face was not decorated with traditional, cheerful clown makeup. Instead, it was completely covered in an unnerving expanse of solid black, suggesting they were deliberately trying to hide their identity. The only human features we could clearly discern were their eyes, which, to my young, frightened mind, made the mask of black look even more sinister. The moment of terrified observation was violently broken. Suddenly, Chi-Chi screamed. We immediately spun around toward her as she pointed frantically and shrieked out loud, "There's another person watching us." She was absolutely right. Standing further down, positioned to cut off an escape route, was a second person, also dressed as a clown. This one distinguished by bright green hair and disturbingly longer legs. In that terrifying instant, we all knew that we had to flee immediately. The sight of the two clowns, the waving figure, and the second, grotesque figure with the long legs, was the ultimate trigger for flight. Chi-Chi and Mike immediately took off running, a desperate sprint for safety, and the rest of us did not hesitate to follow their lead. Chi-Chi ran toward the familiarity of her apartment downstairs, while Jess and I instinctively ran for the stairs, heading upstairs to our mother's apartment. We burst into the room, breathless and in a state of sheer panic, and found our other brother Eli already there, talking to our mom. Our mother, seeing the terror on our faces, immediately gave us the biggest, most comforting hugs. We were initially confused by her immediate emotional reaction. Did she somehow already know what had happened? It was Eli who quickly explained the situation. Eli then recounted his own frightening experience to us. It turned out that he had been hiding in the apartment complex's central courtyard. He had cleverly concealed himself behind a large bush. He heard footsteps and naturally assumed it was Zach, the seeker, about to find him. He saw the person step right in front of the bush. He thought his hiding spot was blown, but then, to his confusion, he heard Zach's voice calling his name, followed by Zach announcing, "I found you." It was only when Eli turned back to look up at the spot he'd just vacated that he saw the chilling truth. A clown was looking directly down at him, positioned menacingly above the bush. Eli ran away instantly, with Zach. I sincerely wished the entire ordeal had ended right there, with the safety of our mother's hugs and the relief of being indoors. But the night had one final terrifying twist. Much later, when everyone in the apartment was sound asleep, I woke up feeling intensely thirsty. In the middle of the night, I quietly went to the kitchen to get a bottle of water from the fridge. As I stood by the fridge, I distinctly heard a noise coming from outside the window. It was a soft but persistent knocking sound against the glass pane. Now, as an adult, I recognize how utterly foolish my next action was. The apartment was on the second floor. It should have been impossible for anything or anyone to be casually knocking on the glass. But the sheer absurdity of the sound and a morbid curiosity only a child can possess drew me toward the source of the noise. This specific moment is what truly scared the living daylights out of me. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I slowly walked to the window. With my heart pounding relentlessly, I cautiously lifted the blinds. The next moment was a scream, frozen in my throat. An image burned into my mind forever. I came face to face with the clown. It was the same one my sister and I had first encountered in the alley. The one with the impossibly tall stature and the terrifying, blacked-out face. He was looking directly at me, his head only inches from the glass. The shock was immediate and absolute. I didn't think, I just reacted. I let out a raw, desperate scream and immediately ran from the window, scrambling to my mother's room, crying out for her. She immediately woke up and rushed out to see what was wrong. Through my panicked sobs, I managed to drag her back to the window to show her what I had just seen. But in a perfect, the space outside the window was completely empty before my mother could see a thing. Luckily, my mother was a good and compassionate parent. She saw the genuine terror in my eyes and believed me instantly, despite the lack of evidence. She stayed with me until I calmed down. The simple question of how that person managed to scale to a second-story window remains unsolved mystery. They must have climbed something. My next unsettling encounter occurred when I was 11 years old and a student in the 6th grade. The walk home from school was dominated by an old, severely beat-up-looking house situated directly across the street from the school premises. As a child, the house truly scared the living daylights out of me. The house was not just old, it was aesthetically disgusting, dilapidated, and seemingly unkempt. I could not understand why anyone would live there and be comfortable with the exterior's terrible condition. Whenever my friends and I passed that decaying house on our daily walk home, they would inevitably make fun of its wretched appearance. I, however, would scold them, worried that the owner of the house might overhear us and react angrily to middle schoolers mocking their home. My friends, of course, found this immensely funny, constantly teasing me for being a scaredy cat and being afraid of an adult's angry reaction. They weren't wrong. I was consistently fearful of an adult's confrontation. Passing the house was just an uncomfortable routine for a while. But when October rolled around and my friends began staying late for various after-school programs, I found myself walking home alone again. And that is when the routine took a dark and unsettling turn. The change began during the second week of October. Walking home alone for the first time in a while, I passed the creepy house and immediately sensed that something was profoundly off and different. As I walked by, I noticed a subtle yet deeply unsettling detail. Someone was standing absolutely still in one of the house's dark windows. The figure appeared to be staring directly at me as I walked past. This sight immediately freaked me out, but since nothing else happened, I tried to rationalize it and brush it off. However, this was not an isolated incident. The pattern repeated itself day after day. As I walked the same route home from school, the same person was always there, a static voyeur watching me from the dark frame of their window. I couldn't distinguish if they were male or female. All I felt was the intense, paralyzing fear of being perpetually watched. I confided in my friends, hoping for validation, but they simply shrugged off my fears. They suggested that the person was probably just playing an early Halloween trick on me, deliberately trying to scare me easily. I tried to believe their casual explanation, scolding myself internally for being such a nervous wreck. But a week before Halloween, as I maintained my lonely trek home, the figure was no longer relegated to the shadows of the window. On this day, I noticed the tall silhouette of a person standing openly on the house's porch, clearly watching me walk by. The sight was a sickening blend of fear and confirmation. Despite the fear tightening my chest, I tried to remain calm and brave, maintaining a steady pace as I walked past the house, hoping they would remain static. Just as I drew level with the porch, the situation took a sudden and frightening turn for the worse. The figure suddenly flew down the steps and immediately began to chase me. I screamed at the top of my lungs and instantly transitioned into a full, panicked sprint, putting some serious energy into my step. My legs felt sluggish and weak. The person behind me was clearly very fast and was gaining on me quickly. Judging by the unintelligible, shouted words and the pitch, the person was seemingly a dude. The things he was yelling at me made absolutely zero sense at all, adding to the sheer terror of the situation. I knew I had to find a place to hide, and I needed to do it immediately. My mind raced to find cover. In a desperate, split-second decision, I veered off the main road and ducked sharply into a nearby alleyway. My chosen sanctuary became a dumpster that smelled absolutely horrible, behind which I crouched low, trying desperately not to make any sudden noise that might guide this crazy person to my location, where they might potentially hurt me. My auditory sense became hyper alert. I could clearly hear the runner's heavy footsteps stop abruptly right by the alleyway's entrance. The man was right there. I could also hear him mumbling words to himself in a low, unsettling tone as his footsteps slowly began to walk closer, approaching the very dumpster I was crouched behind. My heart was leaping out of my chest, beating a violent, painful rhythm against my ribs. ... I closed my eyes and desperately prayed that he wouldn't think to peek behind the large metal container and find me. The tension was excruciating. I could literally hear his heavy, ragged breathing, making me feel certain he was about to discover my precise location. Just when I thought my cover was about to be blown, I suddenly heard the distinct sound of his footsteps running away from the alleyway, the sound rapidly fading into the distance. I remained absolutely frozen, crouched on the filthy ground, giving myself enough time to collect my shattered nerves and to be absolutely certain that the man was truly gone and that the coast was finally clear for me to move. Once I felt fully confident that the area was safe, I ran the remaining distance home as fast as my shaking legs could carry me. The moment I burst through the front door, I immediately told my parents every terrifying detail of what had just transpired. My father, recognizing the severity of the situation, made the immediate decision to call the police. They arrived at our house within 20 minutes, patiently taking my statement and asking for the precise location of the house and the man who had chased me. Once they had all the necessary information, they let my parents and me know that they would investigate the area and provide us with an update the following day. They were true to their word. The next day, the police returned with the official and deeply unsettling information. Nobody lived in that house. It had been completely vacant for years. The fact that the house had been vacant for years made absolutely no sense, given my daily observations. The police speculated that the perpetrator was most likely a homeless man or a squatter who had been staying illegally in the abandoned property and, for whatever perverse reason, decided to single me out and terrify me. Nothing further was done by the authorities after that. When I told my friends the house was vacant, even they were left in shock and disbelief. Thanks to that terrifying day, I still get intensely scared whenever I pass a house that looks creepy or abandoned. Even now, as a 22-year-old adult, that day remains agonizingly fresh in my memory. Switching continents, the final story comes from my life in a rural area of Poland. My country is still very much Christian, so Halloween is not widely celebrated, with many older people perceiving it as satanic. However, nowadays, many do decorate their porches with stacked pumpkins. At that time, I had a fixed habit of taking my dog Susie out for a walk every evening. Susie was rather large, and her tendency to hate kids and cyclists, often barking aggressively and trying to bite them, made daytime walks a genuine nightmare. In the fall in Poland, darkness descends very quickly. 8 p.m. feels like the dead of night. Without streetlights, visibility is nearly non-existent. That specific day, it was already dark, and I headed out with Susie. My preferred route was a short 10-minute road that ran from the local supermarket, which was close to my house, to a local church. This path was bordered on one side by a dense forest, and on the other by a large horse stud. At night, this path was virtually empty. You rarely encountered another soul there. I used to love the autumn vibes, the cold breeze, the satisfying crunching of leaves underfoot, and the peaceful feeling of solitude. I was walking along, completely lost in my own thoughts, approaching the end of the road where the forest met an old, unused stable that historically belonged to the local parish priest. As far as I knew, this stable had been out of use for many years, even before I was born. It was at this specific point that my quiet thoughts were violently interrupted. Susie suddenly snapped out of her calm pace and started barking like crazy. Her reaction was immediate and intense. I looked around quickly, trying to see if a cyclist or another dog was approaching, but then I realized she was only focused on one specific area: the old stable and the trees immediately surrounding it. Susie's behavior was utterly unhinged. She was barking, growling, and pulling hard on her leash, acting far more frantically than she typically would. I should mention that seeing anything clearly beyond the tree line was incredibly difficult due to the very dim and old streetlights in that location. Desperate to understand what was causing her extreme agitation, I squinted into the dark trees near the stable. And then I finally saw it. Maybe 10 to 20 meters away, positioned just behind the priest's old stable, I could clearly make out the silhouette of a man. At first, my brain struggled to identify the shape, initially thinking it might be a strangely formed bush. But the closer I looked, the more certain I became. It was definitely a person. Judging by how their clothing caught and reflected the little available moonlight, they must have been wearing an outfit that was all white. The figure was kneeling, with their back perfectly straight. They weren't moving at all, simply frozen in that position. Yet they were undeniably looking in my direction. The sight sent profound chills down my spine as I realized they were wearing some kind of white robe. I immediately pulled hard on Susie's leash, desperate to get her to move away, but she was stubborn. Knowing I couldn't stay a second longer, I grabbed her firmly by the harness and took off, walking away as quickly as possible. I deliberately chose not to run, unsure if the man realized I had seen him. Thankfully, I made it home without further problems. However, that night, I was abruptly awakened by the loud, incessant wailing of multiple sirens. The next morning, I saw the news. The stable had been set on fire. The common gossip suggested it was drunk teenagers, but I knew the person I saw was disturbingly calm, poised as if waiting for something. What truly bothers me is the timing. At least 5 or 6 hours passed between seeing him and the fire. Was he kneeling there the entire time?